الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. After praising Allah Azza wa Jal and sending peace and blessings upon His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his family and his companions, we continue with a new chapter within Kitab al-Salah, and it is the last chapter inside of Kitab al-Salah. So the book Buloogh al Maram by Imam al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala is divided into kutub. We can call them in English maybe sections or major chapters. So the major chapter that we are in right now, or the main section of the book that we are in right now, is Kitab al-Salah, the section which relates to the prayer. And we're at the very end of it. We're about to finish it, inshaAllah ta'ala, in maybe 1 week or 2 weeks. We'll complete that chapter or that section. That section on the prayer is broken up into chapters, or you can call them sub-chapters if you want to call the chapter of the prayer and then sub-chapters. But in any case, the very last part of Kitab al-Salah is Bab al-Libas, the chapter relating to clothing. Now in general, clothing is not something that many of the scholars mention in Kitab al-Salah. It's often delayed towards the end of the books of fiqh. However, the reason that Al-Imam Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala brought it in Kitab al-Salah is because he wants to inform you and to educate you that having proper clothing is a condition of the prayer. And there are some articles of clothing which can harm a person's prayer, either the validity or the reward of it. And so here we're going to hear about different types of clothing, some of which can render a prayer either invalid or can at least remove the reward of the prayer from a person. And so it makes sense to cover those on the topic of prayer at the end of the prayer. As if Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar is saying, this is not really related to the prayer, but it's some information that you might need if you wanted to be able to, or if you want to be able to pray properly as you should, you're going to need some information about al-libas. And al-libas means clothing. Al-libas, it means clothing, and generally refers to what you wear on the body, the clothing that you wear to cover your awrah. And the first thing we have to talk about when we talk about al-libas is we talk about al-aslu. Al-aslu fil libasi al-ibaha. The basic principle as it relates to clothing is that clothing is permissible. The only clothing which is forbidden is very limited things which are clearly explained within the hadith. So the basic principle of clothing is not like prayer. Because in prayer, what did we say? The principle in the ibadat is that everything is haram unless you have an evidence to make it halal. Every single prayer that you can pray is haram unless you have an evidence that makes that prayer permissible. If you want to pray dhuhr as 7 raka'at, you can't do it. 8 raka'at, you can't do it. 9 raka'at, you can't do it. 1 raka'at, you can't do it. 2 raka'at, unless you are traveling, you can't do it. 3 raka'at, you can't do it. The only dhuhr prayer you can pray is the one mentioned in the hadith. Clothing is the opposite from this. Every kind of clothing is halal except the clothing which is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah as being haram. So al-aslu fil libas al-ibaha. The basic principle or the basic ruling as it relates to clothing is that all clothing is permissible. except that which there is a clear evidence to make it haram. So if somebody comes in wearing some new clothing, we don't say to that person, you know that clothing you're wearing there, are you sure that it's halal? Rather, it's the opposite. You say to them, are you sure that it's haram? Are you sure that it's haram? In other words, if you don't have an evidence that it's haram, then the basic principle with regard to clothing is that clothing is permissible. You have to bring me a proof that it's haram. I don't have to bring you a proof that it is halal. You have to bring me a proof that it is haram. There are very limited, broad sort of topics of what is haram in terms of clothing. So we can summarize it right now. So there is clothing which is prohibited for both genders, and then there is clothing prohibited for men and clothing prohibited for women. And the number of things which are prohibited are fairly limited. We can mention the main ones right away, just to give a summary. So, as it relates to men, we have the prohibition of wearing silk, of wearing red, and of wearing clothes dyed with safflower, if I think that's the right word for it. And clothes that resemble women. So for men, we have silk, we have red, we have clothes that are dyed with safflower, and we have clothes that resemble women. On the side of women, there is no doubt that women's clothing differs from that of men in general. So the woman's clothing, what might be permissible for a man might not be permissible for a woman, because it may not cover her awrah, because her awrah differs from that of a man. That's the first thing. And the second thing for the women is that which resembles the men. And the women's clothing that resembles men. And as for what is prohibited for men and women, then this includes that which does not cover the awrah, or that which is, if it covers the awrah but it shows the awrah in some way, it's transparent or it's tight or whatever. Bearing in mind that that differs from men to women in the sense of what it's defined as, but the prohibition is for both. And likewise, the clothing which resembles the non-Muslims, which is unique to them. And this is important, because some people may say, for example, a person comes in wearing, let's say, for example, normal business attire. And another person says to him, you resemble the non-Muslims. That's not correct. Because the business attire that people wear is not unique to non-Muslims. It's not something that if you see someone wearing it, you instantly identify them as not being a Muslim. From the things that are prohibited are religious clothing of the non-Muslims. For example, the black skull cap that the Jews wear, or the collar that the Christian priests wear that has the white starch in the middle, or likewise the robes that the Buddhist monk wears, anything which is specific to their religion, or anything which if you wore it, you would be immediately identified as being one of them. So there are some clothing that is not religious, but if you wear it, you instantly identify that person is not a Muslim. So it could be some clothing related to, people wear, which is kind of shaitani, it relates to the shaitan in some way. But in any case, when you see a person wearing it, you instantly identify that this person is not a Muslim. This is the clothing that we have been prohibited from as it relates to resembling the non-Muslims. As for the clothing that is just generic, like business attire, like, the casual clothing people wear that maybe a non-Muslim wears it, a Muslim wears it, different people of different countries and different religions all wear it, it's not something unique to them, then this is not prohibited. So we said the clothing that resembles the non-Muslims, and the last one is libas al-shuhra, which is clothing you wear in order to stand out. So libas al-shuhra, it literally means the clothing of fame. But the meaning here is clothing you wear which is worn for the purpose of making you stand out among the people. And this is a little difficult because there could be examples of permissible clothing which in some countries could become libas al-shuhra. It could become an example of the prohibited clothing that a person wears. And this could be sometimes it could be difficult. For example, we might say that in a particular country, people wear a particular style of clothing, men wear a particular style of clothing, maybe women wear a particular style of abaya or a particular style of clothing. And for non-religious reasons, it's not the case that you wear different clothing for the sake of your religion. Like you wear different clothing because their clothing is haram and yours is halal. But you wear different clothing to stand out so that everybody looks at you when you walk down the road. This is an example of libas al-shuhra. And as we said, it could get complicated because, for example, let's just say in a country where all of the women wear a black abaya, for example. And then one woman, she wears, let's say, for example, a pink color abaya. So that when she walks down the street now, whether she wants it or not, everybody looks at her. Even if we say the abaya doesn't have a color which is legislated in the Sharia by default. It doesn't have a color which is legislated in the Sharia, that it has to be black. It has to it has to lower the gaze or it has to not make you want to look at it. But it doesn't have a particular color. But she's in a country where all of the women wear black. And then she walks among them wearing pink. So now, whether she wants it or not, everybody is going to look at her. This could be an example of libas al-shuhra. Even though in another country where the women wear multiple colors, it may be not the case. It may be the case that nobody is looking at her because actually all of the women habitually wear different colors in that country. Even some of the mashayikh, and this is where it gets difficult, some of them, I heard some of our teachers say to us that you shouldn't wear the thawb or the kandura in a country where it's not, where you stand out in front of everybody. But this becomes difficult because it becomes an issue sometimes of deen, not just an issue of what you wear. Because, for example, it could be that the people wear tight clothing and you want to wear something loose. Or, for example, in the UK, I don't think it's libas al-shuhra to wear a thawb or a kandura because people wear many different styles of clothing and you can't really say there is one style that kind of, that kind of covers, that everybody wears. It's kind of accepted to wear different styles of clothing. But I've heard some of the mashayikh even say, if you're in a country where nobody wears the style that we have in the Gulf, the long robe that we have in the Gulf, if nobody wears that in the country, then you shouldn't wear it in the country, unless you have a religious reason for doing so. So what about if a woman says, what about wearing the hijab? Or what about wearing the abaya? Or what about wearing the niqab? In a country where none of the women wear it. We say this is not libas al-shuhra. Why? Because it is a religious requirement. And libas al-shuhra doesn't enter into the issues of religious requirements. It enters into the issues that are not related to religion. It doesn't enter into religious requirements. So if she's the only woman in the country that wears the hijab, she has to wear it, even if nobody else in her city wears it. Because this is a religious command. It's a command from Allah. So it's not a matter about whether she stands out or she doesn't stand out. But here we're talking about in the issues of permissible clothing, where the two types of clothing are both halal, they're both permissible, then you don't wear the clothing that stands out if both types of clothing are permissible, whether your intention is to stand out or not. This falls under libas ash-shuhra, wearing clothing in order to stand out. So these really cover the most important aspects of the clothing that you shouldn't wear. But one thing that we have to be, we can mention right from the outset is the issue relating to the prayer. So in the majority of cases, the clothing that you are required to wear in the prayer, or that you are prohibited from wearing, is of two types. There could be a prohibition which is specific to the prayer, meaning directly related to the prayer. So for example, covering the awrah. Covering the awrah is something specific to the prayer as well as outside of the prayer, but it has specific evidence for it in the prayer. In this case, if a person does not cover their awrah and they don't cover it and they know about that, then their prayer becomes invalid. As for the prohibitions which are general, like men not wearing silk, that is not specific to the prayer. There are no ahaadeeth which say for men not to wear silk in the prayer. These ahaadeeth say not to wear silk at all, inside or outside of the prayer. Then it seems that the prayer is not invalid because of this. If a man wears silk and prays, his prayer as a prayer is valid. And the reward that is dependent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the person is doing something haram by praying wearing silk. However, the prayer is valid because the prohibition is not unique to the prayer. It's not something that is specifically mentioned in relation to the prayer. It's not something which is specifically mentioned in relation to the prayer. It's something which is general inside and outside of the prayer. So the prayer does not become invalid. However, there are certain issues which are going to be where there is a difference of opinion. So we're going to talk about, for example, the prayer of the one who is musbil, whose thawb is below their ankle, and whether their prayer is accepted or not. And likewise, we're going to talk about also the issue of the one who prays without covering the awrah and the issues relating to that. But aside from those limited issues, generally, if the prohibition is general, then it doesn't invalidate the prayer by doing it. So likewise, praying in stolen clothing. This is something some of the scholars mention. As-salatu fi thawbin maghsoob. Somebody wears clothing that is not, it's not theirs, it doesn't belong to them. They took it from somebody, or they stole the money from somebody and they bought clothing with it. The prayer is valid because the prohibition doesn't relate specifically to the prayer. So this is a benefit generally, because if a prohibition relates specifically to something and it's mentioned in the context of the prayer, then the prayer becomes invalid if you break that rule. But if it's a general prohibition that is for the prayer and outside of the prayer, and it's not mentioned in the specific context of the prayer, then in this case, inshallah, we say that the prayer is valid, even though the person is sinful for wearing that particular clothing. As for clothing, we know there is no doubt that it is from the blessings of Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Ya bani Adam, qad anzalna alaykum libasan yuwari sawatikum warisha wa libasu taqwa dhalika khayr. Allah said, O children of Adam, we have sent down for you clothing that covers your awrah, your private parts. Warisha, and it is something beautiful and decorative, it's an adornment. And this tells us that there are two purposes to clothing in general. The first is to cover the awrah. This is the first purpose of clothing. And the second purpose of clothing is to beautify a person's appearance. To beautify a person's appearance. And that's why there's no doubt, if a person, even if a man covers his awrah to a to the extent that he's required, but he doesn't have, like maybe all of his clothing, he will not look as good as if he wears his finest clothing and all of his adornment. He will look better than if he just covers the minimum amount. So the awrah is a minimum standard. But beyond that, there is adornment and beauty in taking care of your clothing. And that brings us to remind ourselves of a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Indeed, Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. And that shows you that it's not forbidden to wear nice clothing and to take care of your appearance, as long as that doesn't become exaggerated or go beyond the limits or go into wastage and things like that. And there is no harm in having care of your appearance and taking care of your appearance. Allah Azza wa Jal said, وَلِبَاسُ التَّقْوَى ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ. The clothing of taqwa is better. The clothing of taqwa, some of the scholars here, they mentioned the meaning is that when you clothe yourself with taqwa, by doing what Allah commanded you and avoiding what Allah prohibited you from, you become beautiful on the inside and the outside. Whereas beautiful clothing adorns a person, but it doesn't make them righteous. So for example, if you take the most beautiful clothing and you put it upon a fasiq, upon a disobedient person who's openly disobeying Allah, that clothing doesn't make their inside beautiful. It doesn't make them righteous. It makes them look nice from the outside, but it doesn't change who they are on the inside. But taqwa, having that fear of Allah and piety and righteousness, it changes who you are on the inside and it changes who you are on the outside. It gives you nur on your face. It makes you a person who, even on the outside, there is a beauty that comes with obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a certain beauty that comes in the appearance of a person when they obey Allah, even if their clothing is not adorned and not beautiful. So libas al-taqwa, it decorates you from the inside and from the outside. It makes you beautiful on the inside and it makes you beautiful on the outside. Our first hadith. عن أبي عامر الأشعري رضي الله عنه أنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ليكونن من أمتي أقوام يستحلون الحرى والحرير رواه أبو داود وأصله في البخاري. From Abi Amir al-Ash'ari رضي الله عنه, that he said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, there will certainly be from my ummah a people who will declare adultery and silk to be halal. And this is narrated by Abu Dawood, and the full hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari from the ta'liqan, in the ta'liq form in Bukhari. In other words, Al-Imam al-Bukhari, he missed a part of the chain in this hadith. But the hadith is sahih. There is no doubt about it. So there are a few things that we have to talk about here. The first thing is the statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لَيَكُونَنَّ, there will certainly be. This is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam informing us of something that will happen in the future that had not yet occurred at that time. And the scholars say that it is al-khabar bima'na an-nahi. It's a statement which implies prohibition. The Prophet ﷺ here doesn't prohibit adultery and silk in terms of, say, silk is forbidden for you. He informs you that there will be a people who make istihlal of these things. And this is an evidence for its prohibition, because the word istihlal or yastahillun is only used in relation to something haram which people falsely claim to be halal. So we don't say istihlal for something that is halal. You only say istihlal for something that is haram. Because you can't declare something to be halal, a people can't come along and falsely claim something to be halal unless the original state is those things are haram. So that's one evidence. One evidence that these things are haram is in the statement yastahillun, because istihlal is only said about something which is originally haram. And the second evidence is the inclusion of zina. Because zina is absolutely unanimously agreed upon by every single Muslim to be haram. And there is no Muslim who ever said that zina is halal. So the fact that zina is mentioned here even further evidences that these things are prohibited, because it's mentioned along with az-zina, al-hira. In some of the riwayat, it's mentioned al-khaz, al-khazza wal-harir. Al-khaz is a type of silk. So there are two, in some of the narrations it mentions adultery and silk. And in others it mentions two different types of silk. Al-Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, when he narrated this hadith, he narrated it in a longer way. And he included other things. Among the things which are found in the narration of Al-Imam al-Bukhari is al-ma'azif, musical instruments. And there will come a people who will declare adultery and silk, the wearing of silk. And among the things that Imam al-Bukhari narrated is alcohol, al-khamar. They will declare alcohol to be halal, and that's another evidence that these things are all prohibited, because they're mentioned along with alcohol. And al-ma'azif, musical instruments. And that's the wording of Imam al-Bukhari. لَيَكُونَنَّ مِنْ أُمَّتِي أُنَاسٌ يَسْتَحِلُّونَ الْحِرَى وَالْحَرِيرَ وَالْخَمْرَ وَالْمَعَازِفِ. The hadith in Bukhari is long. It mentions the punishment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send down upon them. So this hadith also contains the evidence that music is prohibited and that musical instruments are prohibited. The next thing that we have to talk about in this hadith is the word ummati, my ummah. So we know that generally the word ummah, as it relates to the Prophet ﷺ, refers to two groups of people. Ummatul da'wah and ummatul ijabah. Ummatul da'wah is everyone that the Prophet ﷺ was sent to, whether they accepted or didn't accept. So everyone from his time, from the time he became a prophet until the last day, these people who are alive in this period, their prophet that was sent to convey the religion of Islam to them was the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. From the time that he became a prophet until the last person upon this earth. Those people, all of them are from Ummatul Da'wah. They are from the Ummah of the people that the message was targeted at, the target. Whether they accepted Islam or whether they didn't accept Islam. As for Ummatul Ijabah, they are the Ummah, i.e. the people who accepted Islam, for whom the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is their prophet. So the scholars in explaining this differed. Are the people who declared these things, declared zina and wearing silk and alcohol and musical instruments to be halal, are they from Ummatul Da'wah, i.e. are they from the people who came after the Prophet ﷺ? Or are they from Ummatul Ijabah? They were people who were Muslims before they declared these things to be halal. The problem with them being Muslims would be that declaring something halal that you know to be haram is kufrun mukhrij min al-millah. It's kufr which takes you outside of the religion of Islam, whether you do it or not. And this is the danger of istihlal, that istihlal takes you outside of Islam whether you do the action or not. So if you declare something to be halal that you know that Allah made haram, not that you have a shubha over, you have a doubt over, you got confused about it, you didn't think it was haram, you misunderstood the hadith. We're talking about somebody who knows that this thing is haram and he declares it to be halal. Whether he does it or he doesn't do it, he leaves Islam by this declaration. And this is called istihlal, or al-kufru bil-istihlal, and a person who disbelieves by making something halal. But this in itself we need to stop at for a moment, because this also has masail we have to be careful about. Because people misuse this concept of istihlal to make takfir upon others, yani to declare other people to be non-Muslim. So there are a couple, it's a long topic and we don't have time for it, but just a couple of things I will warn you against. Number one, not everyone who does something is mustahillun lahu. Not everyone who does something believes it to be halal. How many times do we do things we know to be wrong, and we know that they are wrong, but we do them out of a weakness, we do them because the shaitan whispers to us. So just doing something doesn't make somebody mustahil, that they're declaring it to be halal. And this is why you hear people say, this person is not a Muslim because he does XYZ. This person is not a Muslim because she does XYZ. That is not an evidence. Istihlal is where they say, I believe it to be halal. Doing something does not take you outside of Islam, Allahumma, unless we're talking about leaving the prayer or something like that. Just doing a sin doesn't take you outside of Islam. But istihlal takes you out of Islam whether you do it or whether you don't. So a person says, Wallah, I've never drank a drop of alcohol in my life, but I believe alcohol to be halal and I don't believe it to be haram. This person leaves Islam. Whereas the person who says, I drank alcohol every single day believing it to be haram, this person doesn't leave Islam. So don't look at the fact that a person does something or a person allows other people to do it, that means that they believe it to be halal. That's not sufficient as an evidence. And the second thing is, al-hududu tudra'u bishubuhat, that we don't carry out punishments and we don't apply rulings when there are doubts or confusion. So for example here, somebody says, I believe music to be halal. You say, how can you not be astaghfirullah, music, how can you say it's halal? He said this hadith in Bukhari is da'if, because al-Bukhari didn't mention the whole chain. He missed out his shaykh from the chain. This person does not leave Islam, because this person actually is confused about the ruling. They've got confusion. It's not that they are making a statement against Allah that I know it's haram and I'm declaring it to be halal. They got confused about the hadith. So we say to that person, we explain to them, we show them the hadith is sahih, we show them the complete chains from other narrations, we show them the reason that al-Bukhari mentioned this ta'liqan, and we show them so on and so forth, until they become the ayat of the Quran and so on, until they become convinced that it is haram. But we don't say that the first time a person comes and says that I believe that men can wear silk. And we say to him, why? How can you say this? He said, I don't think the hadith is sahih. Or I don't think that harir means silk or something like that. Then in this case, the person should be explained and should be clarified the situation. We don't make takfir of them because of this, if they have a shubha or they have a doubt. And there's no doubt that there are certain things in which doubt is very hard to imagine. like alcohol, like zina. There are certain things which it's hard to imagine a person having doubt about alcohol being haram. But wallahi, even in our days of ignorance, the doubts in these things are becoming more. Like you might find a person, he says, I believe certain types of alcohol are halal. Like he says that I believe that only alcohol is haram if it's made from grapes. I don't believe that alcohol made from barley or wheat or alcohol made from dates or whatever is forbidden. I only believe that alcohol made from grapes is forbidden. This is very rare, but you might find somebody like this that you have to explain to them that they are ignorant. You have to explain to them. And likewise, we even found now people saying things like, I don't believe there is a hijab in Islam. There is such a thing as a hijab. There is no doubt that this in itself is kufr, that takes you outside of Islam. Because this is no doubt, it is inkar ma yu'lam min ad-din bi-darura. It's rejecting something that is known in the religion by necessity. However, even in this day and age, we are seeing this happening more and more. So again, we don't rush to make takfir of people on this issue. Because instead we sit with them and we say, why do you think this is halal? And we definitely don't use people's actions as a pure justification for declaring them to be non-Muslim based on istihlal. Because this is what you see from the takfiriyun all the time. That you ask them, what is your evidence this person is kafir? He says, my evidence is that he drinks alcohol and he conducts his business with riba. You say, this is not an evidence. How do you know he doesn't believe it's haram? Say, well, if he believed it's haram, he wouldn't do it. Then we're all in a problem, because all of us do things that are haram that we believe to be haram, but we didn't know the ruling of properly, or we had some doubt about. So the key thing is that we don't rush into this issue of istihlal and making takfir based upon it, but we return it back to the scholars and the people of knowledge, and we take it seriously, because this is an area where it's easy for a person to fall into error. In any case, the opinion that the Sheikh Salih al-Fawzan brings in his explanation of Buloogh al Maram is that these people were Muslim before they made these things or declared these things to be halal. That they were people who claimed Islam for themselves, meaning min ummati al-ijaba, yani from the ummah of the Muslims, who then went away from Islam by declaring these things, zina and silk and alcohol and musical instruments, to be halal. The purpose of bringing this hadith in Buloogh al Maram is to emphasize the prohibition of wearing silk for men. And we're going to hear later on in the hadith that are going to come later on that this prohibition is unique to men and it's not prohibited for women. But as we said, if a man wore silk and prayed, his prayer would be correct, because the prohibition of silk is not specific to the prayer. It's general for everything. And we're going to see that there are exceptions to this as well. So we're just going to quickly go through a couple of ahadith on the same topic of silk. وعن حذيفة رضي الله عنه أنه قال: نهى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن نشرب في آنية الذهب والفضة وأن نأكل فيها وعن لبس الحرير والديباج وأن نجلس عليه. رواه البخاري. Hudhayfa narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Hudhayfa radiyallahu anhu narrated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam forbade drinking from vessels of gold and silver. We already covered this in Babul Aniya, in the topic of vessels that you can eat and drink from, and eating in them. And he prohibited wearing silk and dibaj. Dibaj is a kind of thick silk. It's got a name for it. It begins with which I've forgotten. Brocade. So a dibaj is a kind of thick silk, and some of the scholars said it's pure silk. In any case, whether it's thick silk or whether it's pure silk, it doesn't matter. وَأَن نَجْلِسَ عَلَيْهِ, and that we sit on it. And we're not allowed to sit on it. We're not allowed to use it as decoration for the room, like to put curtains on the wall and things like that, and pillows made of it and things like that. And the hadith is narrated by Imam al-Bukhari. وعن عمر رضي الله عنه أنه قال نهى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن لبس الحرير إلا موضع إصبعين أو إصبعين أو ثلاث أو أربع متفق عليه واللفظ لمسلم. And Umar رضي الله عنه said, the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم forbade wearing silk except for the amount of 2 fingers or 3 fingers or 4. And the hadith is agreed upon and the wording is that of Muslim. This hadith adds one of the exceptions to the wearing of silk, which is that if silk is used to decorate the cuffs or to decorate the neck or this part here on the chest, if there's some decoration around the edges, around the seams, which is done with silk, as long as that silk does not exceed 4 fingers of silk, then there is nothing prohibited in this regard. And you're allowed from 2 to 4. You're allowed anything less than 4. Here, the meaning, as we said, is the seams. So often it's the case that the seam of clothing might have some silk stitching in it, or it might have some silk decoration or embroidery on the edges. There is no harm in this, inshallah, as long as it does not exceed that amount of silk which is mentioned in the hadith. And this is out of making it easy for the ummah, because we know that some things may have a small amount of silk in, or there may be a small amount of silk in the lining. That doesn't, inshallah ta'ala, harm as long as it doesn't exceed the amount that is mentioned. وعن أنس رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رخص لعبد الرحمن بن عوف والزبير رضي الله عنهما في قميص الحرير في سفر في حكة كانت بهما متفق عليه. And Anas رضي الله عنه narrated that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم made an allowance. And this is another evidence that silk is prohibited. What's the evidence silk is prohibited from the word rakhasa? Rukhsa is only made for something that is originally haram. You only have the word rakhasa, is only used for something that is originally not allowed, and then an allowance is made for it, a leniency, an allowance is made. He made it for Abdul Rahman ibn Auf. He sallallahu alayhi wa sallam made it for Abdul Rahman ibn Auf and Zubair ibn Awam radiyallahu anhuma to wear a shirt made of silk during travel. During travel has no mafhum for it here. There's no mafhum for during travel, meaning that you have to be in travel, whether you're traveling or whether you're not. But the reason was for a hikka. They had irritation. What do you have for that? Hikka, scratching, itching. You had like irritation and you're scratching. And because they were scratching and they had irritation, the Prophet ﷺ made an allowance, a rukhsa, for them to wear silk shirts. And the hadith is agreed upon by Bukhari and Muslim. So this tells us that there is nothing wrong with a man wearing silk and praying in silk if he has a reason for that. Likewise, within this hadith, the scholars also mention a person who doesn't find anything to cover his awrah with except silk. Because now he has a choice between wearing silk or praying without any clothes. So there's no doubt that if he has nothing to cover his awrah with except silk, then wearing silk is more befitting than to pray without any clothes or to pray without proper clothes. So there is no harm, and this rukhsa it's not haram in any way, and it's completely permissible for a man to wear a silk shirt if he has an allergy or something which is causing him scratching or irritation, or a doctor advised him to do it for some medical reason. وعن علي رضي الله عنه أنه قال كساني النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حلة سيراء فخرجت فيها فرأيت الغضب في وجهه فشققتها بين نسائي متفق عليه وهذا لفظ مسلم. From Ali radiallahu anhu that he said, the messenger of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave me a hulla. A hulla is a set of clothing from the top part and the bottom part, an izar and a rida. So the two sheets of clothing, when they come in a set, You have like a top half and a bottom half, like you buy the ihram. You have a top half and a bottom half. It's called a hulla. A hulla, and this hulla is siyara. Siyara here, it means that it was mostly made of silk. But they say that siyara, it means it had a woolen lining. So usually what they say here is that there is wool underneath and silk on the top. But what shows is that it's silk. And this shows you that it's not allowed even for a man to wear partially silk clothing, because this hulla was not exclusively silk. It had a woolen lining, and the silk was woven over the top of the wool. But still it was prohibited when the silk shows more than that, 4 fingers. The Prophet ﷺ, Ali radiallahu anhu, understood that he gave him this clothing to wear. But actually he gave it to him in order to share it among the women folk of his family. So Ali radiallahu anhu came out wearing it. So he said, I saw the anger in his face. So I shared it among the women folk, among my women folk. And this hadith is agreed upon. And this shows the permissibility of a woman wearing silk, and that it's not prohibited for a woman to pray wearing silk. It is only prohibited for a man. So what happened is Ali radiallahu anhu understood that this clothing was for him to wear. So he wore it, he came out. When he saw the anger on the face of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he realized that he was not supposed to wear it. So he came and he changed and he gave it, he shared it out among the women in his family. And this wording is that of Muslim. And the last hadith we're going to cover on the same topic. وعن أبي موسى رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال أحل الذهب والحرير لإناث أمتي وحرم على ذكورهم رواه أحمد والنسائي والترمذي وصححه. From Abi Musa رضي الله عنه, the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم said, gold and silk are permissible for the females of my ummah and haram for the males. And the hadith is narrated by Ahmad and Nasa'i and Tirmidhi, and he declared it to be sahih. And this hadith is, as he said, it is sahih. So this brings us to the end of the topic of silk. We still have some ahadith to cover. One, inshallah, next week we'll finish the topic of clothing. But we just wanted to establish the topic of silk to start with. That silk is prohibited for the men, but it's not prohibited for the women. And that a small amount of silk, so for example, if you're wearing clothing that has a small amount of silk in it, or you're wearing clothing that has some silk decoration around the cuffs and the collars and things like that, then there is no harm in that, inshaAllah ta'ala, as long as it does not exceed the amount mentioned in the hadith of Umar radiallahu anhu. And likewise, that it is permissible to wear silk if you have a medical reason for doing so, until that medical reason goes away. And once that medical reason has gone away, then you're no longer permitted to wear silk. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll stop there and we'll continue to talk about the issue of clothing. We have only a few topics or a few ahadith left to talk on the topic of clothing. And of course, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar doesn't bring every single hadith in this chapter on the topic of clothing. So there are some things we mentioned in the introduction that he's not going to mention a hadith for. Like the prohibition of resembling the non-Muslims. Like the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." Whoever resembles a people is one of them. But within most of the hadith covers most of the prohibitions and most of the issues relating to clothing